Paganini was truly a born genius. Fast forward to the 20th century, and there are only two that I can really name as true born geniuses, and those are Jascha Heifetz, of course, and Yehudi Menuhin. Would you agree with that, or would you include some additional born geniuses in that group? What do I mean by born genius exactly? It's a little bit difficult to explain exactly, but certainly this is a level above the talented child prodigy. There's something extra special involved here. Indeed, one needs to be careful when using that word genius, born genius.
He's a talented boy. Genius is another word. That remains to be seen. Genius is a word one uses very, very rarely.
What helps me to understand it is Paganini, certainly, Mozart, or in other spheres, people like Lionel Messi, when he made his breakthrough in the Barcelona team. Or Mike Tyson, who some believe was capable of knocking out a fully grown man already by the age of 12, and in the ring was taking on giants much bigger than himself and KOing them. I think maybe Antonio Stradivari was a born genius. Somebody who has a gift from God and who uses that gift to go and transform the world that they are experts in. In violinistic terms, what can we say is a true born genius? Again, I can only really think of two in the 20th century. Well, I would say they play like an adult by the age of 4, 5, 6. By the age of 10, they play better than all of the adult violinists around them. They only have to be shown a phrase once to remember it perfectly, probably by age 3. They have perfect pitch, impulse vibrato, natural skills of interpretation. A child who can interpret Beethoven, Mozart better than an adult. That's something uncanny. In the case of Heifetz, we're talking about an individual like Paganini who revolutionised the entire violin technique, turned it on its head, and no one could ever look back from that point. Heifetz revolutionised the technique in a manner not seen since Paganini, but some would say also that Menuhin changed the world. Let's go on to see to what extent. He was younger than Heifetz. He was heavily influenced by Heifetz when he was young. But those two really are the ones of the 20th century in terms of genius. Not necessarily my two favourite. Heifetz certainly is my favourite. I wouldn't put Menuhin even in my top 5. But I have to recognise he was a genius. And I am a fan of Menuhin. Certainly in the UK with the older generation of violinists, it seemed like you had to be either in the Heifetz camp or in the Menuhin camp, which is a shame. I think nowadays with the younger violinists, that's probably less. There's less of a divide like that. The Menuhin camp would say that Heifetz was cold, and the Heifetz camp will be saying many of the things that I'm going to actually be touching on, controversially probably, especially if you're a die-hard Menuhin fan, in this video. With Menuhin, the genius child, less so perhaps revolutionising the whole technique like Heifetz, but in his case, he had an ethereal, angelic sound right from childhood that moved adults, probably moved many to tears actually, when they heard him play. Here's what a newspaper critic said following a Menuhin performance from 1929 in Berlin. There steps a fat little blonde boy on the podium and wins at once all hearts, as in an irresistibly ludicrous way. Like a penguin, he alternately places one foot down then the other. But wait, you will stop laughing when he puts his bow to the violin to play Bach's Violin Concerto in E major No. 2. Here's what Henry Roth says when he describes Menuhin's genius. He puts it this way: Menuhin had the instinctive ability to express a phrase, to tell a story with his violin. It goes without saying that they would have a uniquely recognisable sound. If you hear them on the radio, you more or less know straight away who they are. Roth also speaks about Menuhin's nobility of style and in his book Violin Virtuosos on page 157, that Louis Persinger was overwhelmed by the boy Menuhin's unlimited ability to absorb the repertoire. We're going to be quoting quite a bit from Henry Roth as this video proceeds, because what he says about Menuhin is very well written and of great interest. But we have to ask, which Menuhin are we talking about? Because there are two Menuhins, in fact.
Ooh, Yehudi, ooh, Yehudi, someone please lend us a hand, solve this mystery if you can. Is he mice or is he man? Just who's Yehudi?
The brilliant young Menuhin, who sadly barely lasted until his late teens, early 20s, and the Menuhin who came after that, who experienced rapid decline. This is different to Heifetz, who went on getting better and better and better until the early 70s, when he quit in his prime. This is something many would admire Heifetz for. Unlike some other players like Ricci and Menuhin, who just carried on even though the playing was starting to go downhill. Even though personally I'm glad they did, because it's still delightful to listen to 90-year-old Ricci playing something. Another one who went even further than Heifetz in maintaining his technique into his 80s was, of course, Nathan Milstein. Henry Roth says that Menuhin's failures are part and parcel of his unique story. You won't hear Roth say that about Heifetz.
He's a musician, isn't he? Musician. What's he play? You know nothing, you. What's he play?
And you say you want me to bring my banjo?
There's a name on every time.
Yehudi Menuhin was the 20th century's greatest violinist.
There are certainly many who feel that way. Menuhin has been described as one of the greatest violinists of the 20th century. His recording contract of 70 years is the longest in the history of the music industry. At the 13-year-old Menuhin's concerto debut in Berlin in 1929, Albert Einstein was in the audience and afterwards was heard to remark tearfully that the day of miracles is not over. Our dear old Jehovah is still on the job. The conductor was no less than Bruno Walter, friend of Gustav Mahler, who long afterwards recalled that he was a child, yet he was a man and a great artist. Of course, the name Yehudi actually means Jew, and in an interview republished in October 2004, Yehudi Menuhin recounted to New Internationalist magazine the story of his name. Obliged to find an apartment of their own, my parents searched the neighbourhood and chose one within walking distance of the park. That's in New York. Showing them out after they'd viewed it, the landlady said, "And you'll be glad to know I don't take Jews." Her mistake made it clear to her the anti-Semitic landlady was renounced and another apartment found, but her blunder left its mark. Back on the street, my mother made a vow. Her unborn baby would have a label proclaiming his race to the world. He would be called the Jew. This is all the more astounding and interesting when you consider that one of Yehudi Menuhin's sons actually became a Holocaust denier. More on that a bit later. He was not technically Jewish since his mother was English. Neither am I. My dad was, though, because my dad's mother was Jewish. And this account of Yehudi Menuhin's life reminds me of a humorous occasion when I encountered my Jewish auntie from Israel, and I was asking her, "Do you know the violinist Yehudi Menuhin?" She said, "Who?" I said, "You know, Yehudi Menuhin." "Who?" "Yehudi Menuhin." "Ah, Yehudi Menuhin. Oh, yes." So there you go, that's how the Israelis pronounce his name. He was regarded as a highly interpretative musician who played with great feeling. But let's get back to this question of the two Menuhins then, the very young Menuhin and the Menuhin that came after. And by the way, there's so much that the Menuhin that came after, with his technical struggles, gave to the world that I'm in no way discounting that portion of his life, because it's full of wonderful experiences, which we'll touch on in this video. And I may get some stick for saying this, especially from the die-hard Menuhin fans. So to cover myself, I'm going to start quoting from Henry Roth's book and his chapter in Violin Virtuosos on Menuhin, because Henry Roth is no fool. On page 155, Roth says that Menuhin encountered technical problems in early maturity and talks about the violinistic and musical phases of Menuhin's career. On page 156, Roth hints at a potential lack of careful scale and arpeggio practice and mentions overdone slides. He talks about a freewheeling, quasi-gypsy spirit that was imbued upon Menuhin by his teachers. And revisiting the earlier quote, but completing it on page 157, Louis Persinger was overwhelmed by the boy Menuhin's unlimited capacity to absorb the repertoire, so that he permitted him to indulge his fabulous intuitive powers at the expense of developing his analytical faculties. When he went to Enescu, this problem was compounded, according to Roth. Menuhin would go on to describe George Enescu as the greatest all-round musician he ever met. Ysaÿe apparently immediately spotted Menuhin's deficiencies, as we read on page 158. And Ysaÿe laconically advised Menuhin to practice scales and arpeggios. Roth blames both of his mentors, in fact, Persinger and Enescu, for being overly permissive with Menuhin because they were just so blown away by his genius. On page 169, talks about the golden age of Menuhin's youth drawing to a close around the end of the 1930s or the early 1940s. And many professional observers insist that he never again played as well, and that his playing began to deteriorate, and Roth agrees with this assessment on the instrumental expertise level. His bow arm became strangely unsteady, and at times his intonation was wayward. These problems, of course, became more severe until in later years a Menuhin performance could be a toe-curling experience. Roth hints that when Yehudi Menuhin's first marriage failed in the aftermath of that sad event, he suffered greatly and his playing suffered as a result, and Menuhin never fully recovered his playing to the heights he'd reached prior to that. And in the words of Roth, he had to contend with the most onerous rival of all, Yehudi Menuhin and his early reputation. So the later Menuhin's biggest rival was in fact the earlier Menuhin. And Roth describes the stages of Menuhin's life as preteen prodigy, phenomenal adolescent, young adult in the throes of disintegration. And although he states Menuhin made a recovery on page 162 of his book, he was unable to achieve his earlier greatness in terms of pure playing ability. Roth does acknowledge, though, that there were plenty of violinists who played more nearly perfectly than Menuhin did, yet these violinists were unable to move the audience and the listeners like Menuhin did. Later on, Roth says he plays sharp and suffers from trembling in the lower half of the bow. So now this brings me on to Roth's description of Menuhin in his prime and beyond. These are his words: a sound and style permeated with sensuality. Highly individual Menuhin slides and position changes are described as lascivious. Dragging a finger with marvellous effect, a distinctively Jewish player in his ethos. A tone with an ineffably human quality in a strikingly personal way. An air of nobility in his interpretations. A legend successfully sustained by force of his personality, and says that Menuhin aims for the heart of the music as he feels it and is willing to make sacrifices towards that end. That is a somewhat courteous way of putting it, shall we say. Some would perhaps describe Menuhin as less manly than other violinists in the way that he comes across. I personally, though, like listening to him speak about violin and music. I find that what he has to say is interesting. I especially like listening to him in French, which he has full command.
Monsieur Yehudi Menuhin, vous n'êtes pas tzigane, pourquoi ces hommes vous fascinent-ils?
Déjà, il y a 63 ans, quand je les ai rencontrés pour la première fois, garçon de 13 ans, en Roumanie, garçon de 11 ans, donc 75 ans, c'était pour moi une remarquable expérience.
In terms of Menuhin achievements, there is of course the famous Elgar Concerto recording when Menuhin was 16 with the composer himself conducting. Do you think that version is the best? Henry Roth states that the Heifetz version is more immaculate. However, Rob Cowan, in his Guinness Classical 1000 book, assigns the Symphonie Espagnole of 1933 definitive version to Menuhin. He disagrees with Roth on the Elgar Concerto and assigns the early Menuhin performance the definitive version. But as well as that, Ernest Bloch Concerto, Wharton Concerto, an SQ Violin Sonata No. 3 with his sister Hepzibah, and the Bartók Sonata for solo violin, all these definitive versions are assigned to Menuhin. So a total of 6, far less than Cowan assigns to Heifetz, but still significant number. Menuhin decided to go away with the goal of bettering the Heifetz moto perpetuo that Heifetz recorded in his youth. Someone should have told him that it is impossible to better Heifetz on that piece. Never have I heard such a clean and fast combination with a more climactic ending, although Menuhin perhaps emerged producing a faster version. You can read about that on page 159 of Henry Roth's book Violin Virtuosos. Menuhin was also the catalyst of the intermezzo's resurgence to fashion in the Symphonie Espagnole by Lalo. Heifetz admits it. Menuhin was also what could be termed as a bit of a dabbler. Now, some would criticise Menuhin for that, whilst others would praise him for it. For example, he teamed up with Grappelli to play jazz. He dabbled in Scottish music and was known to be captivated by the Scottish fiddle tradition. He also dabbled in yoga. He apparently discovered yoga in 1951, and in 1952, during a concert tour of India in aid of famine relief, he met Ravi Shankar. In 1953, Life published photos of him in various esoteric yoga positions. Perhaps it really helped him to relax, which is very important in violin playing. He also collaborated with the legendary Indian sitar player Ravi Shankar. In this sense, Menuhin was over a decade ahead of the Beatles. Okay, let's go back to the beginning now and step through the main events of Lord Yehudi Menuhin's life. Yehudi Menuhin was an American-born British violinist and conductor, also an educator and humanitarian. He also played the viola and the piano, and is considered to be one of the 20th century greats of the violin. Yehudi Menuhin was born in New York City to Moshe Menuhin, a Lithuanian Jew from Gomel in modern Belarus, and Maruta, a Crimean Karaite, also Jewish. Through his father Moshe, he was descended from a rabbinical dynasty. Moshe and Maruta met in the Mutasarrifate of Jerusalem, part of historic Palestine under the Ottoman Empire, before marrying in New York in 1914. In late 1919, the pair became American citizens and changed the family name from Menuhin to Menuhin. Little Yehudi was born on the 22nd of April 1916 in New York City, New York, USA. And he died on the 12th of March 1999, aged 82, in Berlin, Germany. Menuhin's two younger sisters were concert pianist and human rights activist Hepzibah, born in 1920, and pianist, painter and poet Yalta, born in 1921. Yehudi asked for his first violin when he was 4 years old in 1920. His first duo recordings with Hepzibah as pianist took place in 1933. Menuhin's first violin instruction was at age 4 by Zygmunt Anker and lasted 2 years. His parents had wanted Louis Persinger to teach him, and Persinger agreed and taught him from 1923. Menuhin took lessons for a while from Persinger at his Hyde Street studio in San Francisco. Yehudi Menuhin made his first public solo appearance in November 1921 at a pupils' concert. On the 29th of February 1924, he formally debuted in solo performance for a matinee concert given by the San Francisco Symphony at the Oakland Auditorium under the direction of Alfred Hertz, with Persinger playing the piano accompaniment. His first full-length recital with Persinger took place in 1925. This performance of Mendelssohn's concerto caused a sensation. This was followed by a recital at the Scottish Rite Hall, and his reputation preceded him to New York for his debut there on the 16th of March 1926 at the Manhattan Opera House. In 1927, 2 performances of the Beethoven Violin Concerto with the New York Symphony Orchestra, with Fritz Busch conducting, were hugely successful and catapulted Menuhin into international stardom. He played the Beethoven in Carnegie Hall with the New York Symphony. Persinger accompanied Menuhin on the piano for his first solo recordings in 1928 and 1929. Meanwhile, the Menuhins sailed to Europe in 1926. When the Menuhins moved to Paris, Persinger suggested that Menuhin go to Persinger's old teacher, Belgian virtuoso and pedagogue Eugene Ysaÿe. Menuhin did have one lesson with Ysaÿe, but he disliked Ysaÿe's teaching method and his advanced age. Instead, Menuhin went to Romanian composer and violinist George Enescu, under whose tutelage he made recordings with several piano accompanists, including his sister Hepzibah. He studied with Enescu in Paris. Menuhin was also a student of Adolf Busch in Basel. He stayed in the Swiss city for a bit more than a year, where he started to take lessons in German and Italian as well, and the Menuhins established their family home in Basel for a while. In 1927, Menuhin gave his Paris debut when he was aged 10 in 2 concerts with the Lamoureux Orchestra under Paul Perret, Lalo's Symphonie Espagnole and Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto. His first recordings for Victor took place in 1928. In 1929, he received the generous gift of a Stradivarius violin, the Prince Khevenhula, from Henry Goldman. Then in 1929 came his Berlin debut, playing Bach, Beethoven and Brahms concertos with Bruno Walter conducting the Berlin Philharmonic. And at the outset of the video, we related the glowing report that one of the critics gave following that performance. In 1929, he made his first solo recordings for HMV. His first concerto recording was made in 1931, Brooks G minor, under Sir Landon Ronald in London, the labels calling him Master Yehudi Menuhin. Then there was that famous recording of 1932 with Edward Elgar conducting, of the Elgar Violin Concerto in B minor. This recording was for HMV in London, although Elgar originally dedicated this work to Fritz Kreisler on the score that Elgar gave Menuhin. He had written in his own pen, and also to Yehudi Menuhin, which Menuhin considered a treasured tribute. He toured widely as a teenager, and for a while during the 1930s, he was possibly the most famous kid on the planet. Then the family home was moved to Ville d'Avray outside Paris in 1931. In 1935, the world tour took place where Menuhin visited Australia, New Zealand, South Africa and Europe. In fact, he gave 110 concerts in 72 cities. Between 1934 and 1936, he made the first integral recording of J.S. Bach's sonatas and partitas for solo violin, although his Sonata No. 2 in A minor was not released until all 6 were transferred to CD. In 1936, Menuhin took a sabbatical for 18 months and took some time out at the new family home in Los Gatos, California, which he described as a blithe, young, joyful time. In 1937, the rediscovery of the Schumann Violin Concerto took place, and Menuhin was one of its early performers. See page 161 of Henry Roth's book for further details. In 1939, his first tour of South America commenced. In 1940, he was back in Australia and gave concerts and made recordings with Hepzibah. And in 1940 came the birth of his son Krov. Indeed, his first wife was Nola Nicholas, an Australian heiress that he married in 1938. This marriage would sadly end because Nola reportedly became frustrated with Menuhin's constant touring. Another marriage where the player emerged from playing abroad to entertain the troops. This put a massive strain on the marriage, very similar to Jascha Heifetz and Florence Fedor. Nola Nicholas was actually the sister of Hepzibah Menuhin's first husband, Lindsay Nicholas. And Yehudi had 2 children with Nola. So for Menuhin's 2 marriages, in both cases, Menuhin married a Gentile, not a Jewess. In 1941, Menuhin gave a second tour of Latin America. His interest in the music of Bela Bartok prompted him to commission a work from him, the Sonata for solo violin, which, completed in 1943 and first performed by Menuhin in New York in 1944, was the composer's penultimate work. Bartok was in the audience when Menuhin premiered this Sonata for solo violin. Menuhin described Bartok's music in this way: "His is music which goes beyond the human, which reaches into heaven and hell. Perhaps this is because his music is so deeply rooted in the folk songs and culture of his land and carries the indomitable heritage of eons of time. It is not merely the expression of one man, but the expression of generations." And so Menuhin had a lovely way of stringing words together. And these were Menuhin's words on the death of Bartok. That seems to be the way great creative men die. As they fall to earth, they cause even less disturbance and produce a smaller ripple than a ripe golden autumn leaf floating down onto the surface of a tranquil lake. And as the leaf, they too have given their best to the tree, and only the fantastically hued husk remains to melt away. During World War II, Menuhin performed for Allied soldiers and was accompanied on the piano by English composer Benjamin Britten. They gave a recital for the surviving inmates of a number of concentration camps in June and July 1945 after their liberation, and most famously Bergen-Belsen in April. He performed in some 500 concerts for Allied troops. Menuhin went on to play in Antwerp, Brussels and Paris shortly after their liberation. During the war, Menuhin gave hundreds of benefit concerts, including for the Red Cross, the American Women's Voluntary Services, the Russian War Relief, the Free French, in munitions factories in Britain, and for American and Allied troops, often in combat zones. He also returned to Germany in 1947 to play concerto concerts with the Berlin Philharmonic under Wilhelm Furtwängler as an act of reconciliation, the first Jewish musician to do so in the wake of the Holocaust, saying to Jewish critics that he wanted to rehabilitate Germany's music and spirit. In this he differed from other Jewish American violinists such as Isaac Stern and Jascha Heifetz, who boycotted Germany even after the war. Stern never performed there, whereas Heifetz seemed to limit his performances to the American troops. For his campaign to pardon Wilhelm Furtwängler, the great German conductor who was accused of aiding and abetting the Nazi regime, but who also it seems, helped some Jewish musicians to escape. For this magnanimous attitude, Menuhin was condemned on all sides. In fact, he was described as a bad Jew by pianist Arthur Rubinstein, one of many who boycotted Furtwängler's appointment as music director of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Menuhin was furious, describing their behaviour as beneath contempt, and was vindicated when Furtwängler was eventually declared innocent. In 1945, Menuhin played for the inaugural United Nations Assembly in San Francisco and made his first visit to Moscow that same year. Thus began his friendship with the great Soviet violinist David Oistrakh. Menuhin credited German philosopher Konstantin Brunner with providing him with a theoretical framework within which I could fit the events and experiences of life. He and Louis Kentner, the brother-in-law of his wife Diana, gave the first performance of William Walton's Violin Sonata in Zurich on the 30th of September 1949. He also took up a role as a member of the awards jury in the 1955 Queen Elizabeth Music Competition in Belgium. Following Menuhin's 1947 divorce from Nola Nicholas, he married the British ballerina and actress Diana Gould, whose mother was the pianist Evelyn Stewart and stepfather was the Admiral Sir Cecil Harcourt. In the 1960s and 70s, they lived in Highgate at 2 The Grove, a house which was later owned by Sting. He had met Diana Gould, the British dancer and actress, during his second wartime visit to Britain. The birth of his son Gerard happened in 1948. Gerard was the one who became the Holocaust denier and far-right activist, apparently. Menuhin challenged apartheid in South Africa in 1950, quite a bold move on his part. In 1951 gave his first concert tour of Japan, and also in 1951 his son Jeremy was born. Menuhin's daughter Zamira was born in 1939. She would go on to spend much of her life continuing her father's work, serving as a governor and vice president for the Yehudi Menuhin School for many years. Sadly and tragically, his newborn son Alexis died. Menuhin finally left the US to make his home in Europe. In 1956 he played at the Johannesburg Festival, his last South African visit until the end of apartheid. And he introduced Jacqueline Dupre, then aged 16, at the 1961 Bath Festival. In 1959 he moved to London, and in 1963 he opened the Yehudi Menuhin School for musically gifted children at Stoke-Durbanon in Surrey. It is at my school that in the last few years the reciprocal experience and privilege of learning and teaching has become a way of life to me, said Menuhin. He began conducting during the 1960s and conducted his first opera, Mozart's Così fan tutte, at the Bath Festival in 1966. In 1965, Menuhin was granted knighthood, but he did not receive the title until 1985 when he became a British citizen. He received the Order of Merit in 1987 and was made a life peer in 1993. Menuhin seemed to have almost completely shaken off his American accent and taken on a more British sounding accent. In 1957 he founded the Menuhin Festival Gstaad in Gstaad, Switzerland. He also established the music program at the Nueva School in Hillsborough, California around this time. In 1965, Australian composer Malcolm Williamson wrote a violin concerto for Menuhin. He performed the concerto many times and recorded it at its premiere at the Bath Festival in 1965. Originally known as the Bath Assembly, the festival was first directed by the impresario Ian Hunter in 1948. After the first year, the city tried to run the festival itself, but in 1955 asked Hunter back. In 1959, Hunter invited Menuhin to become artistic director of the festival. Menuhin accepted and retained the post until 1968. In 1971, in his Moscow speech, Menuhin boldly supported Russian dissidents and praised the dissident poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko. In 1975, in his role as president of the International Music Council, he declared October the 1st as International Music Day. The first International Music Day, organised by the International Music Council, was held that same year in accordance with the resolution taken at the 15th IMC General Assembly in Lausanne in 1973. In 1975, Menuhin conducted the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra for the first time and then became their president in 1982. In 1979, he established the Portsmouth International String Quartet Competition, later the London International String Quartet Competition, the leading event of its kind. In 1977, Menuhin and Ian Stutzker founded the charity Live Music Now, the largest outreach music project in the UK. Live Music Now pays and trains professional musicians to work in the community, bringing the experience to those who rarely get an opportunity to hear or see live music performance. At the Edinburgh Festival, Menuhin premiered Rio Rainier's Violin Concerto Due Cante e Finale, which he had commissioned Rainier to write. He also commissioned her last work, Wildlife Celebration, which he performed in aid of Gerald Durrell's Wildlife Conservation Trust. In 1978, Menuhin played with the Quebecois fiddler Jean Carignan for a unique presentation of the Petit Concerto pour Carignan et Orchestre, composed by André Gagnon. This concert appeared on his TV show The Music of Man, broadcast by the CBC. In 1983, Menuhin and Robert Masters founded the Yehudi Menuhin International Competition for Young Violinists, today one of the world's leading forums for young talent. Many of its prize winners have gone on to become prominent violinists, including Tasmin Little, Nikolaj Schneider, Ilya Gringolz, Julia Fischer, Daishin Kashimoto and Ray Chen. In the 1980s, Menuhin wrote and oversaw the creation of a music guides series of books. Each covered a musical instrument with one on the human voice. Menuhin wrote some of them, while others were edited by different authors. In 1991, Menuhin was awarded the Wolf Prize by the Israeli government. Never one to shy away from criticising politicians, during his speech, he chided the Israeli government on its repressive policies towards the Palestinians. Yehudi Menuhin. Menuhin regularly returned to the San Francisco Bay Area, sometimes performing with the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra. Must have been like a homecoming for him. His recording contract with EMI and its predecessors lasted almost 70 years and is the longest in the history of the music industry, apparently. He made his first recording at age 13 in November 1929 and his last in 1999 when he was nearly 83 years old. Over 300 works in total, both as a violinist and as a conductor. From 1984 until his death in 1999, he was the first guest conductor of the Sinfonia Varsovia, with which he performed over 300 times, nearly half of which were between 1996 and 1998. He said that working with no other orchestra gave me as much satisfaction as my work as soloist conductor with the Sinfonia Varsovia Orchestra. In 1991, he became principal guest conductor of the English Symphony Orchestra, a position he held until his death. In 1990, Menuhin was the first conductor for the Asian Youth Orchestra, which toured around Asia, including Japan, Taiwan, Singapore and Hong Kong, with Julian Lloyd-Webber and a group of young talented musicians from all over Asia. Observing Menuhin on video, it looks like his vibrato was wrist rather than arm. Menuhin became an honorary citizen of Switzerland and then also of the United Kingdom in 1970 and 1985 respectively. He conducted the Sinfonia Varsovia in concert for the Pope. In 1987, the Queen made him a member of the Order of Merit, OM. In 1993, he became Baron, the Right Honourable the Lord Menuhin of Stoke-Dabenham, OM, KBE, and took his seat in the British House of Lords. Diet-wise, he was a pescatarian. In 1989, he attended the World Economic Forum in Davos for the first time. And he conducted the Messiah in the Kremlin shortly after the collapse of the communist regime. In 1995, he returned to South Africa to celebrate the release of Nelson Mandela and conducted Handel's Messiah in a township outside Johannesburg. In 1996, his 80th birthday year, he conducted more than 110 concerts. Let's reel off the names of some of Menuhin's students: Nigel Kennedy, Nicola Benedetti, Paul Coletti, Donnie Deacon, Zaba Erdelyi, Peter Tanfield, Bennett McLean, Alberto Lissi. In terms of films, Menuhin was a featured performer in the 1943 film Stage Door Canteen, introduced only as Mr. Menuhin. He performed 2 violin solos, Ave Maria and Flight of the Bumblebee, for an audience of servicemen, volunteer hostesses and celebrities from stage and screen. In 1946, Menuhin supplied the violin solos in the film The Magic Bow. In 1979, he appeared in The Music of Men, a television series. He also appeared in The Mind of Music from 1980. Menuhin performed duets with the noted Indian sitarist and composer Ravi Shankar, who composed the solo piece Prabhati for him. By the 1990s, Menuhin had retired from playing violin and was conducting exclusively. He was involved with numerous causes promoting environmental issues and social justice, in addition to being a prolific writer. His publications include a collection of essays, Theme and Variations, 1972, Works for Musical Instruction, Violin, 6 Lessons, 1972, and Violin and Viola, 1976, with William Primrose and Dennis Stevens. And The Music of Man in 1979 with Curtis W. Davis, and an autobiography, Unfinished Journey, in 1977, released with 4 additional chapters in 1997 as Unfinished Journey 20 years later. Yehudi Menuhin died in Martin Luther Hospital in Berlin, Germany, from complications of bronchitis on the 12th of March 1999, just 40 days before his 83rd birthday. Soon after his death, the Royal Academy of Music acquired the Yehudi Menuhin archive, which I once had the privilege to go and view, which includes sheet music marked up for performance, correspondence, news articles and photographs relating to Menuhin, autographed musical manuscripts and several portraits of Paganini. In 1996, Menuhin's mother, Marutha, died at the ripe old age of 100. His sister Yalta died in 2001, and Lady Menuhin, Diana Gould, died in 2003. Hepzibah Menuhin had died in 1981 before Yehudi. Yehudi's violins. Menuhin played a number of famous violins, arguably the most renowned of which is the Lord Wilton Guarnerius of 1742. Others included the Giovanni Bussetto of 1680, the Giovanni Grancino of 1695, a Guarnerius Filius Andrea of 1703, the Soil Stradivarius, now played by Perlman, the Prince Khevenhula, a 1733 Stradivari and a 1739 Del Gesù. In his autobiography Unfinished Journey, Menuhin wrote, "A great violin is alive. Its very shape embodies its maker's intentions, and its wood stores the history or the soul of its successive owners. I never play without feeling that I have released or, alas, violated spirits." So he had great appreciation for the luthiers. In terms of awards, well, there's a list as long as your arm, but it includes Kennedy Center honours and Grammy Awards amongst others. Another interesting piece of information, a picture of Menuhin as a child is sometimes used as part of a thematic apperception test. Here are 10 essential recordings of Menuhin according to Strings magazine. The Elgar Violin Concerto of 1932, the Paganini Concerto No. 1, and Moses Variations and La Campanella, as well as Moto Perpetuo, 6 Caprices of the 1930s. Encore pieces by Bazzini, Bloch, Dinicu, Granados and others, recorded in the 1930s. The Mozart Violin Concertos of the 1930s. So, 4 of them are early Menuhin. The Bartók Sonata for Solo Violin of 1947. The Beethoven Violin Concerto Romances of 1947. Menuhin meets Shankar with Ravi Shankar on sitar of 1967. Menuhin and Grappelli play Jealousy and Other Great Standards with Stefan Grappelli of 1985. And then also the Beethoven Spring Sonata and Kreutzer Sonata with Jeremy Menuhin on piano, Yehudi's son, recorded in 1985 and 1986 respectively. Menuhin reinvented himself as a Brit and became Lord Yehudi. See my video on this topic of how Menuhin ended up moving to Europe and London. It has to be said, Yehudi Menuhin had an amazing and illustrious career.